From the heart of our nation's capital, here's Family Research Council President Tony Perkins.
The Senate now has the $2 trillion hot potato called the American Rescue Plan. The measure will provide hundreds of millions of dollars to mismanaged blue states that killed their revenue sources by killing economic activity with their onerous coronavirus shutdowns. They also in the bill initially coming out of the House was a more than doubling of the minimum wage. That's being put aside in the Senate because the parliamentarian says doesn't pass the Byrd rule. What else might have to come out of the nearly true $2 trillion bill? Well, joining us to talk about it, U.S. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Tony, it's good to be back on with you.
All right, so the hot potato now is over in the Senate. What's going to happen?
Well, Tony, first off, let me just say about the coronavirus. I saw what Joe Biden said today. He said on the one hand, he was left with a mess, and they've said for weeks that the Trump administration has no plan. On the other hand, all Americans are going to be able to get a vaccine if they want it by the end of May, fewer than 90 days from now. Both of those things can't be true, and what is true is that he was handed a medical miracle, thanks to the laws that we passed last year that provided money for Operation Warp Speed, and thanks to President Trump's leadership and the leadership of those involved in Operation Warp Speed, we have not one, not two, but three vaccines that are essentially 100% effective against severe conditions of coronavirus, hospitalization, and death. If the Democrats and all their propeller heads had been in charge last year, we all know that we would have still been years away from it because they never would have cut the Gordian knots and eliminated the red tape necessary to do so.
Yeah,
and now...
They can't do that. That's inconsistent the way they govern. But let me go back one step further because I want to put this in perspective for our listeners. We've talked about it here with you before, but had the Democrats not been wrapped up in conspiracy theories, we would have been paying attention to this virus earlier, and we probably would have had it resolved sooner. Because you were sounding the alarm about the coronavirus long before it was on the radar screen of most because they were pursuing conspiracy theories.
I did. I started sounding the alarm, Tony, in mid-January of last year in the middle of the president's impeachment trial, his first impeachment trial. And it wasn't for several weeks later that Congress finally got around to passing our first substantial bill related to the coronavirus. And now Joe Biden is saying that, well, there's no time to waste to pass this new bill, the Biden bankruptcy bill, because it's going to bankrupt America. The Pelosi payoff. One reason I think he thinks there's no time left is he's worried that as the virus cases continue to decline or plateau at lower levels than they were just 2 months ago, and vaccination rates surge and states reopen, that the American people are going to realize that this is not about battling a once-in-a-century pandemic. This is about paying off Democratic clients and constituencies. I mean, just look at some of the stuff that's in this bill, Tony. You mentioned the blue state bailout. The bill is going to give billions of dollars to states like California, who have been fiscally mismanaged for years and who didn't even lose money last year. Tony, California has more tax dollars this year than it did last year, yet Congress is about to give California billions of dollars. You could say the same thing over and over again about other Democratic states, and that's because part of the way they're triggering the formula is unemployment rates. Well, who's got the higher unemployment rates, Tony? States with Democratic governors who have kept their states on lockdown since March. Or look at another measure in here. This has not gotten much attention, so I just want to stress it to your audience. Normal Americans, Tony, just a working guy down in South Louisiana who goes out on a rig every 2 weeks, they're going to get their one-time $1,400 payment, one time. Federal employees are going to get that $1,400 payment, and in addition, if they are caring for a child whose school is closed, they are going to get $1,400 every single week for 15 weeks, up to $21,000. For federal employees, for bureaucrats sitting in the swamp whose kids can't go to school, while all of the working men and women across America just get one-time $1,400 check. That's crazy that we are going to essentially subsidize federal bureaucrats whose local cities and school boards are not opening their schools.
And they don't want to, in many cases.
And they'll have even less reason to do so now because the kids' moms and dads are going to be getting $1,400 a week from your tax dollars.
And to go back to put in perspective what you were talking about, how Joe Biden says we've got to move quickly. is if they don't move quickly, they'll miss using this crisis to advance their agenda.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, they are acting as if it were still late December when cases had peaked, when the vaccine had just been rolled out and states were still testing out the most effective methods to distribute it. It's 2+ months later. Cases are as low as they were in October, Tony, and warm weather is on the way, and every American, according to Joe Biden today, will be able to get a vaccine in fewer than 90 days. Yet they still want to spend $2 trillion that we don't have, 90% of which goes to things other than coronavirus.
Right. And what I find amazing is that they, as you talk about the speed with which they want to pass this, I mean, they had to be drug kicking and screaming to the previous smaller relief bills that focused more narrowly on coronavirus relief.
Well, yeah, that's because we passed one at the beginning of the pandemic last March, the CARES Act. Everything since then is largely built on what we did in the CARES Act. The Republican Party in the Senate was willing to pass a bill last July, last August, last September. The Democratic Party in the House objected. Why? Because Nancy Pelosi would rather have an issue for a campaign than a solution for the American people. Now, it turned out not to work for her. They lost seats in the House.
Right.
She's got the smallest majority in 80 years. But only after the election did she finally come back to the table and negotiate another bill. That's why there's no reason for them to take a party line approach here. Look, we passed 5+ bills last year related to coronavirus. Many of them passed unanimously. They passed in the Senate on average with more than 90 votes. It is clear that Senate Republicans were willing to cooperate and work in a bipartisan fashion to address the genuine needs that our country may have. What we are not willing to do is spend hundreds of billions of dollars of your tax dollars bailing out poorly run states or subsidizing teachers' unions who still to this day refuse to go back to school, even if they're given priority access to the vaccine, and 95% of the money of which is not even going to be spent on this school year. That's what we're not willing to do.
Right. While private schools are fighting to be able to meet and teach their kids. I want to go to some of the particulars in the bill that are of great concern to me. This is something that the Republicans in the previous bills made sure that the Hyde protections were there, the Helms protections to keep taxpayers from being forced into partnership with abortion providers like Planned Parenthood. That's not in this bill. Those protections are gone.
Yep. Not in the bill. It's not in the foreign aid sections of the bill, the parts of the bill that would spend tax dollars to try to promote vaccination overseas. It's not in the bill when it comes to the domestic spending either. Our legislation last year, in every instance, ensured that affiliates of Planned Parenthood could not get your tax dollars. That is taken out of this bill. Another thing that's in there is health care for illegal immigrants. You know, the Biden administration right now is facing a crisis at our southern border. I predicted this all of last year. It's like, look, if you promise amnesty, if you promise to reinstate catch and release at our border, if you promise health care for illegal aliens, guess what you're going to have? More illegal aliens at your border. That's what they're getting right now, even though it's the dead of winter. Imagine what it will be like in 60 days. But in this bill, they're promising health care for illegal aliens.
Well, of course, when you take the fence down the border and put it up around the Capitol, that's what happens. I'd have sent those National Guard troops that are going to be permanently stationed there at the Capitol down to the border. That's a clear contrast between the previous administration and this administration. Clear contrast,
yeah. They would rather put a fence around your United States Capitol than a fence at our southern border. So
now, of course, if we can decide who comes and goes and that we can keep some of those inside the Capitol complex, I think I'd be happy. Yeah.
But, I mean, look at what is happening at the southern border. I mean, President Trump had negotiated agreements with Mexico and Central American countries to keep their nationals in Mexico where they could have an orderly process to adjudicate their asylum claims, and it was working. Yes. The Biden administration is affirmatively seeking them out, Tony. They're recruiting them to come to the border. This is not catch and release. This is recruit and release. They're saying, please come back and we'll let you in this time.
Yeah, I went to the border actually a couple of times and saw that as the president put that in place where it had stemmed the tide of those illegally crossing the border. It was processing them, in an orderly fashion, slowing it down, obviously, but the crisis on the border was over.
Yep, that's exactly right. And look where we are now, in the middle in the middle of winter, when Texas is just 2 weeks away from a brutal freezing storm, you had more migrant children showing up at our border than any February in recent times. What do they think is going to happen in April when it's hot in Mexico and Texas?
Yeah. I want to go back to Senator Cotton, I want to go back to the bill for a moment because you'll be voting on it most likely this week. Because it's on reconciliation, it only requires 51 votes to pass, meaning they don't really need any Republican support to get this through if all the Democrats stick together. So 2 questions. Will any Republicans vote for this? And will all the Democrats ultimately support it?
So to my knowledge, no Republican senator is preparing to vote for this. I can't imagine who would, given that this is almost nothing to do with the coronavirus, almost entirely just a payoff to Democratic Party clients and patrons and constituencies. Second, I have to imagine that in the end they're going to get all 50 Democratic votes. There's probably a lot of arm twisting and a lot of hollering and squealing going on behind closed doors right now, Tony. But they view this as their number one priority. This is their way to pay off all the people who've been supporting them in their campaigns for decades. And maybe a controversial amendment here or there will get adopted, but I suspect in the end the Democrats are going to walk the plank on this, but they'll pay the price next year in the election.
Yeah, I think you're right. We saw this back in 2009 and 10 with Obamacare. It cost them the majority, so I think you're absolutely right. Senator Tom Cotton, as always, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us today.